Welcome, thank you for coming. I actually would love to start out with just a little video. So sorry, Tina mentioned my film career. After leaving Disney, I actually kept one foot in animation, and I've continued to freelance on both CG and animated features. But I actually began making live action films. So I'd love to just show you my reel real quick. It's a director's reel, but it's just little snippets from some of my films. And I think it'll set the tone nicely and hopefully inspire. I hope you enjoyed that. Just to give credit, again, I'm a director and I actually edit my own films nine out of 10 times. But my friend Eric Anderson put that compilation together just because I'm kind of in awe of editors for trailers. I think that's an art in itself. And so I got him involved and he picked that footage himself. It's only from 2 films, by the way. You may have recognized, just for fun, the guy in the very first shot and throughout is Feely from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. He became involved with Peter Jackson after doing my film. And then Caitlin Wax, if you saw The Tear, she was in Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, I think, and Madam President with Gina Davis, whatever that was called. Anyway, they all went on to do very well, so I'm proud of having them in my reel. Anyway, hopefully that inspired. It is a bit relevant to today's topic because, again, that moment in which my Theater dell'arte trained actress pulled that tear was meant to be the catharsis for her character at that moment. And then by extension, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, I had hoped, of course, the audience would have their catharsis. First, viscerally, I call it, gut level emotional catharsis, but then a bit later, the sort of what I call cerebral cognitive processing of it that gives you a new thought form or paradigm to walk away with. So it sounds pretty calculated, but I did have a certain approach to that, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. Okay, but I do hope that set the tone and hopefully inspired. I next would love to share some quotes that will also just get us thinking about the word catharsis and what does it really mean. I think, like the words creativity, manifestation, the creative process, story. Do you notice these words? It's a good thing, actually, that they're on the radar of pop culture at the moment and that they're part of our vernacular. But you also may notice storytelling, in a way, just my opinion, and you might share it, has been usurped by advertising, political campaigning. Life is story, if you think about it. Our lives are the stories that we tell ourselves. But personally, I do parse between all the techniques we're going to be talking about, whether they're being employed for the catharsis that is equivalent to personal transformation. And as you know from last week, my premise is if we are experiencing catharsis as individuals during our creative process, and then by extension, we're reaching what we call the patron, and they're having their catharsis vicariously through our creation, how could society at large not benefit is one word, but also evolve toward human potential as a result? So when I hear storytelling being sort of usurped is the word, or hijacked maybe, by advertising and political campaigning, I think it's kind of an abuse of the word. Like we don't own it, but I think the way I put it is I've created a meme in my own brand that basically says, you know, I'm a writer, and it's true, it just hit me one day. I'm a writer because, as I said last week, we learn more in the narrative realm than the didactic. We're going to go into the reasons why today. And learn might mean learn emotional lessons, life lessons, spiritual lessons. But anyway, I wrote in this meme, narrative will always trump the didactic when it comes to transformation. I change minds by touching hearts. This is why I'm a storyteller. So again, if you really grasp this, that persuasion only goes so far. People tend to dig their heels in more when you try to persuade. You've probably noticed that. There's the resistance factor, like with my dog, we were just talking about Bowie. When I pull on the leash, of course he resists. It's an impulse, it's an instinct. So persuasion does not change hearts or minds. And that's why I'm so passionate about the power of storytelling to transform individuals and then society at large. So I'm just sort of repeating the premise there. Before I give you the quotes from, and they're going to be from artists, musicians, you name it, screenwriters, playwrights, political activists, anyone who has a stake in storytelling. I've got quite a variety of creatives or innovators who have contributed, and I think in their words would say have had experienced catharsis themselves and or offered it to the collective. But firstly, I want to do a little clarification from last week, and this will be valuable to those who are sitting in the whole time, but also maybe once they're archived, if you're doing them sequentially, it's kind of necessary to fill a gap. I did mention this last week, but I don't know if I went into enough detail, and it's certainly going to come into play today. So think back to the goal. You may remember that we defined story as, well, we defined conflict as protagonist has goal, something stands in the way of that goal, meaning the antagonistic force, therein lies the conflict. That's the traditional Western definition of conflict. What I didn't spend enough time on is the goal in screenwriting for sure, and in many other traditions of Western storytelling, the goal is split into what's called the want and the need. So we did talk about an example, but I may not have given you that terminology, want and higher need. So think back, let me pull up some visual aids and then I'll continue. Okay, Dorothy, remember her? Okay, so we had said, and I do hope this rings a bell, or surely it'll click if you're new to this week and you didn't see last week. Surely you've seen The Wizard of Oz, or at least I hope so. It's a classic. So we said that Dorothy's ostensible goal in terms of the superficial plot, we said Dorothy's goal, arguably, this is what we always come up with as consensus. There's a million ways to word it. But in my classes at Art Center, we all agree eventually that Dorothy's goal, she wants the wizard to send her home to Kansas. We agree that doesn't happen because the Wizard of Oz turns out to be a fraud. What she needed to do the whole time was simply click her heels together. So the protagonist often has blinders, or what I call hubris, that blind them to their own fatal flaw, and they can't see the higher need. I'm sure we've all seen films where we absolutely know what the character needs to do, but they just can't see it themselves. And that's why they have an arc. They have some fatal flaw that prevents them from seeing the bigger picture. So anyway, you may also recall that the resolution of the conflict is what determines the thematic content you're offering. There are many, many sub-themes, but in our example, you may remember if the metaphorical, so Dorothy just needed to click her heels together. That is metaphorical for Dorothy wants the wizard to send her home to Kansas. Metaphorical for Dorothy's looking outside of herself for contentment, answers, tranquility, peace, call it what you want. She's looking outside of herself. She just needed to click her heels together. That's metaphorical for Dorothy had everything she ever needed in her own backyard. There's even a line in the screenplay that says exactly that. There's a song that I think was on the pop culture radar for 5 minutes. I'm sorry, a book that says everything you ever needed is you learned in kindergarten. So it's a story template, and there are many, many stories on that template. But anyway, the way the conflict resolved is exactly how the message, if it's didactic or moralistic, is imparted, but it's certainly how the thematic content is imparted. So you just take that need, the metaphorical meaning, Dorothy has everything she needs in her own backyard to be content. You generalize it and say, we have everything we need within, without external validation, etc. All right, so that's important to know. Story structure is everything, whether it's examined or whether it's intuitive. I think work is more empowered when you take the time to study it and then, yeah, let it go and let it be second nature. Okay, the second thing I wanted to clarify from last week is the character arc. Again, it was mentioned, but perhaps not enough time was spent. I did watch the video back, is my point. So just know the character arc is distinctly different from the overall story arc. So to recap, we talked about that story arc that you likely learned in elementary with the inciting incident, the escalation of the conflict, the climax, the denouement or resolution, all those familiar milestones and turning points. Separate from that is what's called the character arc, okay? So the fatal flaw that I mentioned that might blind a character, or the hubris that blinds them to the higher need, is where they begin. Then, of course, they transform via the conflict resolution, end up either, if not the precise opposite, they end up in new territory. And the character does have to learn or grow within the 270 pages if it's a novel, or the 90 minutes if it's a feature. And the idea is we grow and transform along with them. So some examples, again, not precise opposites necessarily, but a really kind of universal one is rags to riches. And this should click. You know, from Pygmalion to My Fair Lady to arguably Pretty Woman, that would be the rags to riches. Miyazaki films are all a variation on that, only it takes the form of meek to empowered. And I think many would argue all heroes' journeys are about, you know, meek, finding or embracing or accepting their calling after denying it and eventually being empowered by it. Or another word is finding purpose. So hopefully that one clicks. Greedy to benevolent, just read these on your own. Rags to riches, prejudice to tolerant, love that. Ignorant to enlightened. I want to talk about this one just because I just finished an amazing memoir called Educated, and it's by Tara Weston. Amazing. She was basically raised, not on a commune, but off the grid, put it that way, by unique individuals with zero modern conveniences or technology. They're pretty much conspiracy theorists with foil hats in the closet. And actually she ends up earning her PhD from an Ivy League college. So that's the equivalent of the cave analogy, if you've heard of that, you know, from ignorance to enlightenment. And in her case, the journey was learning not to reject her roots or judge them, but to come full circle and embrace them. Long road for her. Anyway, take a look at these when you get a chance, maybe come up with your own or analyze films you've seen or books you've read and try to get to the bottom of what the arc is. It's so important to a story, to our investment in it, but also for the redemption that we then carry forward. And now let's get to those quotes that I mentioned. It hopefully will continue to set the tone. I love this one, theatricality, that's where you get catharsis. The Greeks went to see drama because they felt that it wasn't happening to them. And we're gonna start with the Greek tragedies today. Why not start at the beginning? So you've heard this a million times. I think horror movie, people that are passionate about horror films say, oh yeah, it's exactly that. You know, it's safe to experience it on screen and get your, I hate to say aggressions out, but get your fears purged while wearing a three-piece suit. And there's another quote on that later. The second one I don't have a slide for, but it's the best catharsis is to write jokes and tell 4,000 people about it. I included that just for humor. That's from comedian and actor Veer Das. And I love that one because we've all seen Taylor Swift burn her exes in her songwriting. That's the extreme of that one. And then this one is great. Look, pain is there in the world and there's catharsis through that. I feel like there's a rapture if we can get through it, if we can confront things. And ironically, I speak French, so I wanted to call him Derek Si en France, but I just saw a video and he basically says, Si en France. So Derek Si en France was the director of Blue Valentine, which I really liked. Don't know if you saw it. This one is wonderful. I see artists as the first responders. And when the proverbial crap hits the fan, we are there to be of service, to tell the story, to bring a balm, to soothe, to provide catharsis. You know, not to make our work any more important or less important, but just that there is a great importance to it. Okay, she takes the words right out of my mouth because I have often said, you know what, I don't assign any lofty importance to what I do or me. I really don't. I mean, one has to, unfortunately, in branding, promote oneself, but I actually don't think I have any special talent. People love to throw that word around. I don't assign any importance to what I do. What I do admire is the creative process itself. What I do put on a pedestal is the way we're wired for storytelling and its immense power. We are a product of the stories we're exposed to, 100%. Society is a collective reflection of that metaphysical realm of values and worldviews that is molded by story. So anyway, I don't think there's anything lofty or important about what I do, but I love that I'm lucky enough to engage in it. I feel it when it's happening, and that makes me passionate about it, which is why we're here. You know, we like CTN, and I both think this is valuable content to offer. I would go on to say, especially right now. So I'm going to skip some of the more academic stuff. It'll be posted online and you can read it later. But frankly, to me, it's not inspiring to talk about the nuts and bolts and the sort of mechanics of how storytelling reaches us. I'm going to skip through some of that. There are slides for it, but I'm going to skip through because, you know, what I think is so much more important to talk about right now is if you look at the divisiveness of the past few years, and it's taken many forms, but specifically the political divisiveness, and without getting political and assigning right or left, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. But surely you've seen there are what I call fascist extremes on both sides. Republican platforms can have a fascist flavor, and so can Democratic ones in their extreme. What I mean by fascism is a police state. So we've all noticed wearing these masks. It's tempting to think our freedoms are being taken away. I understand all sides of it. But when it comes to censorship of the arts, the silencing of what I call subversive voices or voices of dissent, all of our freedoms are at stake. I won't preach anymore, but I know this is on your mind and it's on your radar. It just hit me this morning that it's not worth talking about the chemical part of it so much, but how this responsibility we have to keep those freedoms, okay? So we're gonna talk about how Aristotle, who initially coined the term or popularized it anyway, catharsis, that was 100% his agenda in coining the term, his recognition of how important it is in society. And then the next quote I'm gonna read, similar territory. Okay, so again, this one was perhaps, it was before COVID. I don't remember, about 3 years ago. So mid-term, or maybe during the campaign of a specific individual. It was a very short speech. I just read it online. It's shorter than you realize, and yet it caused huge backlash. And it's that same old story. People saying, just do your job, just act like a dog and pony show. Don't tell us your political views. Don't turn, you know, the red carpet into your soapbox, and don't turn the Oscars into your platform. I take offense to that. I mean, I've been there. I've definitely thought, you know, I don't necessarily want to be preached to on an evening like the Oscars. However, in this case, I thought her speech was not political at all. It was about what we're all invested in, which is our humanity. So I just didn't understand the backlash. And to me, very specifically, when you compartmentalize the actor from the work, or the writer from the work, or the artist from their visual storytelling, for example, you're doing everyone a disservice. Because our worldviews and values, the moral realm of our ideas, is exactly what informs the work, like it or not. Meryl Streep picks her roles based on what she wants to put out into the universe. She infuses it in every moment with her intention. Hopefully she finds inspiration that the universe itself has provided her because it knows what it needs to evolve and propagate and proliferate. I hope that makes sense. So when you say, you know what, shut up, just do your job. It's like using Meryl as a sample platter. I'll take this from you, but not that. Maybe you've heard of a day without gays or a day without artists. The whole idea is like, with gays, all right, we'll wear your clothing, we'll eat your food, we'll allow you to design the interiors of our homes, but just don't let us know you exist. Just be silent. We don't want to hear about your marginalization. You get the idea. Life is not a sampler platter. So I really objected to the backlash. I loved what she said. So the first quote is, an actor's only job is to, sorry, I'm gonna scroll down on my outline, is to enter the lives of people who are different from us and let you feel what that feels like. I do love that. It keys into what we talked about last week. There are studies that show 100% middle grade readers and young adult readers who read literary fiction with redemption, meaning artistic integrity, literary value, as opposed to commercial mainstream fiction, actually nurture compassion and empathy, which serves the tribe, the survival of the tribe, as does altruism. Studies further showed that tolerance is nurtured through literary fiction. And that's simply because children are exposed to cultures they wouldn't otherwise be privy to. And suddenly the other, which might be exotic or threatening, is made more familiar. Hope that makes sense. All right, this is actually Meryl quoting Tommy Lee Jones. It's such a privilege, Meryl, just to be an actor. Yeah, it is. And we have to remind each other of the privilege and the responsibility of the act of empathy. We should all be very proud. And I love it. It's another form of not assigning any importance to it, but assigning the power to the way we're wired for storytelling. The final one, I'm going to try not to, to cry, because I love Carrie Fisher. The first Star Wars chronologically came out when I was 9 years old in '77. So I just loved Carrie, broke my heart when she died, in my opinion, way too early. But Meryl quoted her in that same speech saying, take your broken heart, make it into art. Okay, now that might ring a little bit over-romanticized in that there is an archetype of artist as sacrificial lamb, if that makes sense. Meaning they open their veins to purge their demons for everybody else's benefit, right? If somebody like Ella Fitzgerald, I'm not Ella, Billie Holiday, sorry, very much spent her life contributing, offering catharsis to others, but then her own demons got the best of her. That is but the definition of a martyr. So I actually think it's a little over romanticized. I don't think we all need to suffer for our art. I don't think art needs to be informed by angst personally, but it's an archetype, it's alive and well. So you look at Billie Holiday, Tennessee Williams, if you know him, Amy Winehouse, Oscar Wilde, even Marilyn and James Dean, and then Carrie Fisher herself. We'll never know exactly what forces were at work, but the bottom line is they're missing in action. So I do see them a little bit, not as sacrificing, but contributing, investing in our evolution. And in a very romanticized view, they might well be martyrs for a cause, and that cause would be evolving our moral realm as humans. Okay, so now that we're hopefully inspired, what the hell is meant by catharsis? It's just a word, right? So I'd love, at this moment, I'm going to prompt you, if you're getting involved in the Q&A, just quickly, if you don't mind, just put what your definition of catharsis is in one line. And then also maybe, what does catharsis serve in your own creative process? Do you have a catharsis? Maybe you don't identify with it at all. But I would love it if you could talk about, you know, what form that takes for you. How is your creative process, meaning a project, cathartic for you? Hope that makes sense. If it does, type a little something, and then Tina's gonna sort of share those, and it's we're gonna just talk and further the dialogue about what catharsis actually is. But for our purposes, I'm going to read the original definition as Aristotle coined it. Actually, here, now I'm doing what you're not supposed to do in a presentation. Just call me a high school valedictorian, but I'm going to read dictionary definitions, current, contemporary dictionary definitions. 1, purification or purgation. And I know you can read, but I might as well rattle them off. Purification or purgation of the emotions, such as fear, I might as well botch it. Pity and fear, primarily through art. 2, a purification or purgation that brings about spiritual renewal or release from tension. I'd like you to really think about these words, right? words are not an exact science. They're all full of connotations and cultural relativity. And I just think every one of these words is loaded and open to interpretation. Fascinating definitions. A purification or purgation that brings about spiritual renewal. All of us might have a different definition of spiritual. You get the idea? Or release from tension. What does that mean? Is tension cognitive dissonance? Is tension perpetual crisis mode or sort of fight or flight instinct that's carried over into chronic stress? We don't know, but it's up to you. Number 3, elimination of a complex by bringing it to consciousness and affording it expression. Surely you notice that complex is 100% psychological. So there are schools of thought that say emotional purgation, that catharsis and purgation are emotional. I'm going to share one of those schools of thought that actually this guy says Aristotle was wrong because it's not about emotional. I agree, but the word catharsis could be mental, spiritual, emotional. It could be all of the above. Hope you follow that a little bit. Number 4 is simple purgation. And then to really speed it up, the etymology, Aristotle at the outset used it metaphorically to discuss the 3-act structure of Greek tragedies and what he actually prescribed that they should accomplish. So the etymology, and I'm going to botch the pronunciation, it's something like katharin, to purify or purge. And then linguists, I think, are speculating that katharos plays into it as well. Pure, clear of dirt, clean, spotless, open, free. And then clear of shame or guilt or purified is also tacked on there. So the medical term catharsis is the emptying, cleansing, purging, or evacuation of the bowels or intestines. That came after the metaphorical usage in Greek classicism. Cathartic or purgative is an agent that causes catharsis. In other words, relieves constipation. How's that for an image? And so to recap, it was used figuratively by Aristotle initially. It was first recorded medically in 1770 as a bodily purging, especially the bowels. And then it was first recorded in psychology in 1872 as a purging through vicarious experience. And in psychotherapy, it was first recorded in 1909 in Brill's translation of Freud's selected papers on hysteria. So right there, isn't that testimony to the fact that despite some schools of thought, catharsis can be a transformation of our thought forms and our paradigms, or a psychological complex, as in that definition, just as much as an emotional purging. Okay, so I hope you're with me. If not, rewind. I think that was linear enough. But here's where I get I kind of hit a wall with Aristotle's limited definition. He centers on fear and pity. Those are the 2 emotions he says we purge through catharsis, at least in Greek tragedies. I thought about the word pity. Well, it doesn't mean a whole lot to us, does it, these days? Maybe it does you, but it didn't click for me as something that's on our cultural radar or even computes. Think about the 7 deadly sins. One of them is gluttony. So again, not really on our radar because we have our needs met for the most part in a very privileged country like the United States or wherever you are. I'm guessing you have your needs met. So it's not a mentality of scarcity. In cultural context, gluttony was a deadly sin because there were limited resources and a scarcity mentality. So that word doesn't really mean a whole lot to us nowadays. I feel the same about pity. However, what I came to is back then, pity may have had the connotation a little bit more of judgment. It is hard to have empathy and sympathy for a downtrodden person without judging just a little bit. And nowadays it does lean a little more towards the sympathy and empathy part rather than the judgment. So I'm guessing that's part of the confusion. And then also, if you think of the word self-pity, that seems like something we would want to purge, yes? So maybe there's something going on there where language just is not a perfect science and the translation leaves room for interpretation. But think about self-pity real quickly. It's akin to guilt, shame, and self-loathing. Again, I don't think a lot about the word shame, but I just watched an entire podcast about how it's our worst societal ill. I get it. It's happening a lot on a personal level. So purging it seems valuable to culture. So again, it may have been the same back then. I want to speed this up. Oh, I did have the thought too that when you're watching a cautionary tale, so if neither the want nor the higher need are met, and you literally by definition have a tragedy, there is a sense of futility that accompanies that. Well, if that whole 2 hours was for naught, what's it all for? Our brain wants to rationalize it. So we end up experiencing it basically as a cautionary tale and saying, well, I'm not going to do that. So think of, if you know Shakespeare, Titus Andronicus, probably the darkest Shakespeare I've ever read or seen. And I actually didn't, I didn't know he ran that dark until I saw Julie Taymor's version of it. She directed a beautiful version of it. If you don't know her, she either directed or art directed the Lion King stage show. So in my opinion, genius. See Titus if you haven't. It's visually lush and stylized, but more importantly, her sensibility marries so beautifully with Shakespeare's intention. But the point being, it's a cautionary tale about the dead end road that is family vendetta. It's about the dead end road that is revenge. Hamlet, in which everybody dies, is about the dead end road of patriarchy. Frankly, Ophelia dies because she's a victim of patriarchy. All right, so in that way, cautionary tales function in society despite their seeming lack of redemption. Okay, so now that we're kind of on board with Aristotle's intention, how do we do that? We all know the components we listed last week that help, but how do we do it? He uses, and I got to speed this up, but he uses 3 concepts that are really important to study: pathos, ethos, I'm saying it out of order, and logos. Quickly, pathos is exactly what we've been talking about: a sympathetic or pathetic, not what it sounds like, pathetic, meaning something we can have empathy for. So any quality that evokes pity or sadness is a use of pathos. We went into the chemical secretions last week that result when we hear or see a story of a pathetic individual for whom we can have sympathy. Dopamine, endorphins, adrenaline, oxytocin, all those euphoric chemicals that heighten our state of awareness are secreted when we are submerged in a story, invested in a story like that. Really quickly, ethos is used as a means of convincing an audience via the authority or credibility of the persuader, be it a notable or experienced figure in the field or even a popular celebrity. So we know that best from the political arena and ad campaigns, right? Or just getting a celebrity to hawk your toothpaste. You get the idea. But it is alive and well in the kind of storytelling we're engaged in, which hopefully is not for the almighty dollar, but for our collective transformation. These things are alive and well. Logos, so ethos, I want to go back to that really quick. Think of the archetype in storytelling of the voice of wisdom, or what I call the conduit. So everyone would agree Jiminy Cricket is the angel on the shoulder, the conscience. That actually is the same archetype as the Holy Spirit in the Bible. But in a more concrete way, the conduit or the voice of wisdom takes the form of Yoda, Gandalf, even literally the Oracle from the Matrix. Couldn't be more transparent than that. So those kind of characters actually need credibility, if that makes sense. We as viewers have to see them as the sort of ultimate source of truth or wisdom. Anyway, you get the idea on those, I hope. And now that we define catharsis and these 3 sort of strategies that Aristotle himself was prescribing, let's move on to something we've glossed over. What the hell is story? We haven't even defined story, right? So last week I kind of facetiously said, well, we haven't been able to define beauty or art. These things are elusive, I would say. And there's no good, bad, right, or wrong. It's very difficult to say anything definitive, right, when something's not empirical or scientific. But I think it's worth And maybe you could put that in the chat too. What is a story? Here's one definition I settled on. And by the way, all the definitions I'm offering are either from Merriam-Webster or Oxford Dictionary or Cambridge. They're pretty reliable sources. I think I got lazy and I did include one dictionary.com definition just because it suited what we're talking about. Story, a narrative, either true or fictitious, in prose or verse, designed to interest, amuse, or instruct the hearer or reader. A tale. Now, narrative and story, you often hear them used interchangeably, or narrative, as you noticed, appeared in the definition of story and vice versa. So a narrative is defined in the dictionary as a spoken or written account of connected events, a story, a particular way of explaining or understanding events. Think about that one. A particular way of explaining or understanding events. C, representation of a particular situation or process in such a way as to reflect or conform to an overarching set of aims or values. Those last two, I really hope something clicked there. It should make it clear that our worldview, right, is a lens we wear that affects the stories we see. We'll project onto them, we'll attribute, we'll project. There's no way around it by definition. But also that our lives are stories. Human dialectic, human history is a story. And in fact, in French, I just thought of this, l'histoire, the word for story is the same as history. Histoire, history is what, the vernacular for story. So in that way, I hope you get that our lives are stories, right? The downside of your life being a narrative, in many cases, and I know you'll relate to this, that broken record of a familiar thought form, a familiar neural circuit that keeps firing, that can be the equivalent of a drum that you continue to beat long after it's counterproductive and it stands in the way of you manifesting your desires. I hope that clicks. So sometimes we're trying to undo narratives, right? We're trying to disentangle those neural circuits and create new thought forms and paradigms. I'm offering, isn't a movie theater the best place to do that? Isn't engaging in a book and emerging transformed with new coping skills or tools the way to do it? I'm going to talk about my book in a minute, but Through the Rabbit Hole Tales, which is what I consciously chose to tell, it's a template in which the character goes through a portal like Alice in Wonderland, in theory, to an alternate realm, learns something that he or she can bring back to daily life and use as a coping mechanism. It's metaphorical for the introspective journey, or sort of entering the metaphysical realm, having that epiphany, and then bringing back some kind of wisdom, metaphysical understanding of our disposition, and then applying that. So I hope that's clicking, that storytelling really serves the purpose of, yes, shifting thought forms and paradigms, as well as purging visceral emotions. So last week, quickly, we covered the chemical means by which we hook audiences or readers, right? And it's not just so that they'll be invested in the want or the need and have the transformation, but it's to keep their butts in the seats, it's to keep them turning pages. So quickly, as review, intrigue induces dopamine. We said, among other things, that actually nurtures trust with the group, the tribe, the storyteller himself, him or herself. And then on a larger scale, if we're exercising it regularly like a muscle, if we're indulging in storytelling around the campfire regularly. Pathos, as we said, nurtures sympathy and empathy, and it induces oxytocin. Laughter induces dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins. Okay, all of those together heighten awareness, heighten memory for details. They all result in bonding, which is beneficial for the survival of the tribe, the species, the collective. On the other side of that, and I want to give credit to David J.P. Phillips, unless I didn't last week, he's the one that coined this term devil's cocktail. And I might have used it last week without crediting him. But he calls the devil's cocktail the non-euphoric neurotransmitters or peptides or hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. So we kind of talked about how if you're only seeing action adventure films, you might be feeding your own peptide addiction. But if you're only making those kind of films for the almighty dollar, let's say they're titillating and showing gratuitous violence, not in order to tell a story with redemption, but simply for the almighty dollar, you actually might be feeding a cultural addiction to cortisol and adrenaline. This is no small thing, and it's not moralistic preaching. It's the truth. And there's an entire book that I would recommend. I haven't read it. I want to. I'm dying to. But I did see him on Dick Cavett, the year of my birth, 1968. There was a football player called Dave Megacy that left the NFL and then quickly wrote a book bashing professional football. Now, I'm not agreeing with him. I'm not even invested in it. I don't care. But he says the institutionalized violence of the NFL 100% at that moment habituated people to violence, but it also justified the Vietnam War. It made them more accepting of this controversial war. That's how big that one is culturally. Okay, I think we can move on, but I want to gently suggest this might all seem very academic and very analytical. We all know the ideas for some of this to become second nature. But I do think by sort of examining it, and I think it was, Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. So I promise you, looking into some of the chemical stuff, those very specific techniques that Aristotle spoke about, it'll empower your work. The idea, of course, is to let it go and just tell stories intuitively, I hope. I want to motor through the next slide really quick. The three, pathos, ethos, and logos, are distinctly different from these propaganda techniques. So I do hope, forgive me for speaking fast, but this is the boring stuff. So you probably learned this in 5th grade. I did, and unless education has changed a lot, you know this stuff. This stuck with me. We had a guest speaker in 5th grade that came and talked about this, and I, word for word, remember these terms from 5th grade. Testimonial, this form of propaganda uses well-known or credible figures to influence the target audience. That's actually similar to the ethos we mentioned earlier. Fear appeals. The agenda behind these types of propaganda ads and messages is to scare people into taking a desired action. So that's the equivalent of saying, buy that car alarm because, or buy that club because those thugs out there are dying to bash your windshield, or buy this home security system because they're right outside on your porch waiting to invade your home, or get that flea collar because your dog's going to be chewed to bits the minute you walk out the door. Bandwagon is actually a phenomenon, creates a sense of isolation and triggers FOMO, the fear of missing out, in specific people who long to be part of some desirable group. So as an artist, I'm the rogue, I'm subversive, I've never had FOMO, never had the fear of missing out. But I do get it 100%. Bandwagon technique is all around us all day, every day. Just, picture Kim Kardashian endorsing a product and everybody runs out and buys it. But I do think at the heart of it is really a tribal instinct to belong, right? So we very much want to belong to a group. This explains all identity politics, which feeds into today's divisiveness, right? We may well be evolving out of that tribal instinct to bond and belong, because the downside is, just imagine this, that quickly subverts into having a common enemy, right? Let's protect our tribe against this common enemy. During the Cold War, so many films used, to the point of it becoming a cliche, the Russians as the bad guys, right? Or the Nazis, they're a really convenient bad guy. I mean, that one is well warranted for sure. You get the idea, but in very practical terms, you could say that some of the strife today is rooted in this desire to belong to a group. It explains, this tribal instinct explains all racism institutionalized. It explains all marginalization and ostracization, a lot of societal ills that we could evolve out of through storytelling. Okay, just read the rest for yourself, or investigate the rest for yourself. There will be a document online with the definitions of all of these that you're seeing in the slide. Yeah, name calling, it's what it sounds like, especially in political campaigns. We've all seen, the other candidate being dragged through the mud or disparaged. Ad nauseum propaganda is just repetition of the name of the product or the jingle incessantly so that it's at the forefront of your mind and that product is the first thing you reach for in the supermarket. Okay, yet again, these seem very technical, but I promise you, they are all working all day, every day in storytelling, but with a different objective or outcome. Okay. Now, the guy I mentioned earlier, Adam Skelter, he has a really great book called The Anatomy of Chaos that I recommend. It'll be on the reading list. But there's also more digestible little videos that he's done of, I think, each chapter that are very stimulating. And I listen to them on my, they're not a podcast. They are just YouTube videos, but I listen to them on my walks using my headphones. The Anatomy of Chaos. He says Aristotle was wrong. Storytelling is not about catharsis. I happen to think, well, then he softens it and says, well, I would say, these are my words, actually, it's the tip of an iceberg. He's not wrong, but it's just the beginning. And I agree with that. But I think what he's just trying to be a little bit shocking for his proprietary brand by bucking conventional wisdom. But he basically points to Plato's model. He points to Aristotle's recommendations for this purgation or catharsis that became 100% synonymous with the three-act structure that still informs storytelling or screenwriting today. And he's saying, well, the reason he was so focused on catharsis is because he was just trying to give permission to the arts. Think about it. Before him, Plato, you may or may not know this, kind of pushed this tripartite state idea of the ideal way in which society functions. Believe it or not, it's the root of fascism throughout history, but certainly today. So he recommended that all artists and storytellers, there was a word for it in Greek, but let's just say innovators, creatives, storytellers, artists. That might include craftsmen, artisans, should be ostracized, highly censored, and marginalized. I think he even said, like, take them out to a commune and just keep them separate from society. So there's no one definition of what it is to be an artist, but I know part of it for me is seeing through social conditioning, seeing beyond the status quo. Yes, sometimes that means being subversive or a voice of dissonance, all of the above. And by silencing these voices, we are stunting our own transformation societally. So I think it was huge, right? We owe so much to Greek classicism and of course the Renaissance, just my opinion, in terms of our growth as opposed to the squelching of our humanity. So basically Adam Skelter is saying, well, Aristotle really was just trying to give permission to artists and with a limited understanding of brain chemistry at the time. So he goes on in these videos to very specifically describe, and I don't know that we can get into it today, but describe the specific means by which chemically we do transform through storytelling. But in the end, I think, as we said, there is no one definition of purgation or transformation or catharsis. It can be cleansing your thoughts as well as your emotions. So it's not one or the other, and it's not mutually exclusive. I hope you follow that. I want to go back to last week's example. You may remember we spoke about Bonnie Raitt. Let's say she got her heart broken. Her pain was very real. It was raw. She immediately wrote a song and got it out of her system. Then by extension, somebody 2,000 miles away hears it on their car radio, feels a little less alone, and that speaks to like bonding through our shared humanity. But then she is released from her demons, or her, call them complexes if you want. And then by extension, my premise is society evolves as a result. These specifics we're talking about today are just the means by which we do that. I said last week, and it's very oversimplified, that we learn through conflict resolution. It's been proven time and again. That's why innately we infuse conflict into storytelling. More specific this week, we learn through metaphor. And I do think it's worth getting to the bottom of that one, and then we'll go back to the fun stuff. So let's start at the very, very beginning. Why do we learn through metaphor? And I'm using the word learn a little bit facetiously. Why do we transform? It could be totally spiritual, mental, emotional. I'm sorry, not mental, not cognitive, not intellectual. Learning tends to be more cognitive. But we can learn things, right, through cellular memory that are emotional. We actually remember them more if they're ingrained into what Eckhart Tolle would call our pain body, or, you know, the DNA, our cellular memory. There's a lot of schools of thought on this. But starting at square one, there's the outer world. This came from David, the outer world and the inner world. The inner realm is our thoughts, feelings, you know, worldviews, paradigms, emotions, all those invisibles. The outer world is what it sounds like. Now, philosophically, and even in quantum mechanics, there's a question as to which is real, the subjective reality or the objective. We may never get to the bottom of that one, and it frankly doesn't matter. But what we do all day, every day, is our sense organs perceive, they take in data. But they don't interpret it. The brain does that, right? So what the brain does with that data is what's more important. So very quickly, our brain makes a determination. Is this a threat or an opportunity or something I can relegate to the back files, the subconscious? If it's quickly deemed to be a threat or an opportunity, then the needed chemicals to react in the best interests of our survival begins to happen immediately, long before the cognitive process can get involved. Hope that makes sense. So you might see a rustling in the bushes. You don't know if it's a tiger or, I don't know, a honey badger. I just came up with that. You don't know if it's a threat or not, but fight or flight instinct kicks in immediately. Your physiology changes, your breathing, your pulse rate, all of that because of the adrenaline and the cortisol. That is all done, you know, in a microsecond, long before your brain gets involved. We could call those physiological responses emotions, right? So if we talk about an opportunity scenario where the thing you're perceiving, the beautiful female, I'm just using that as an example, the beautiful female that just appeared between the bushes, you might suddenly swing, you might suddenly instinctively see it as an opportunity. This actually explains 99% of human behavior. So the dopamine and all those euphoric chemicals that are produced increase your chances of sealing the deal and actually propagating. Hope that makes sense. So let's agree quickly, emotions are created, then the thought is attached later. It doesn't end there. There's a reciprocal relationship. You can imagine an actor using the method acting, who uses a thought to produce that tear. I'm in awe of actors that do that. It happens twice on my reel, by the way. So we can, and some cultures actually may, I don't want to go on too much, but may encourage drama, like manufactured or fabricated drama. It's a little more acceptable. We're a little more reserved, right? Our Protestantism, and I happen to be British partially, and like all of that, it makes for major reserve. We control those impulses and instincts. But anyway, there is a reciprocal relationship between thoughts and feelings, and I would say check it out and decide for yourself. But it is true, we secrete those chemicals long before we formulate them and organize them and create a worldview, hint, hint, or a value system, hint, hint. That's the mapping of all of it. The emotion is first. So, sorry. Let's say our brain does eventually map everything and categorize the threats as high priority, as opportunities or threats, sorry. The opportunities are for our expansion. It's for the tribe, right? Procreation only serves the tribe. So once this map is created, let's say, we have what's called reasoning. When the cognitive brain gets involved, it's called reasoning. I would argue reasoning is equally important to our survival. These quick emotions, fight or flight, may allow you to defeat that lion and go on another day. But it's been argued. Imagine if you have a sort of knee-jerk reaction to something, we've all done it, and then later you think, ooh, was I acting, was that distorted based on a past experience? And again, Eckhart Tolle calls it the pain body. So when we question ourselves, we absolutely bring in our reasoning mind to temper our knee-jerk reactions. So I think together, the intellect and the viscera create what's needed for survival. What the hell does this all have to do with storytelling? Because of this innate understanding that the chemistry is how we ingrain this stuff, the priority of what is crucial or vital to our survival, this mapping that I'm talking about, is based on what created, right, an emotion in the first place. What are those experiences in life that time and again create a heightened, what we're calling emotion, but let's think of it as a secretion of neurotransmitters. That's what gets mapped on the brain. Do you see how that is how our worldviews are shaped, or our value systems? So if you create heightened emotions in a theater or via the experience of reading a book, you're immediately mapping them on the brain, and that's specifically literally how it becomes our worldview. I think I'm going to take a break and we'll just open it up to some Q&A. I hope that much landed. And then Tina, remind me in a bit, but I want to end with some more inspiring quotes on this same topic. If there's not time for everything, I promise I'll include them in the reading, the supplemental reading.
We do have questions. What is your definition of catharsis? You were asking them, and what does it serve in your own process? A couple of people mentioned things. Cinta mentioned that for them, it means liberation and self-expression. Another, if I don't know if you want me to just go through.
No, I love that. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll respond to that one. I often do speak of self-expression. Last week, we talked about how a lot of artists are internal, right? I think shyness is a good word, but we're all internal, and self-expression, the way we talked about it last week, is actually our way of connecting, right? It's our way of validating that we exist, but also by extension, touching or enlightening or educating others. And it's proof that we're alive, it's validation, but you see how the byproduct is, that's kind of what we're saying here. Whether you know it or not, the byproduct is connection and enlightenment. So really quickly, you are prompting something here. You've probably heard people say it's a very popular school of thought, and for very good reason. My friend Nathan, who's a great writer, says, well, you can't set out to write great literature. I don't disagree. But his premise is, you know, it is death to it's death to all art to be too fixated on the outcome or the result. You just have to serve a process and be in the moment. Kind of like life, right? The mechanics of manifestation are such that if you're too fixated on the goal, the universe cannot provide the happy accidents through synchronicity that you only recognize when you stay in inspiration mode, and that requires a level of detachment. Manifestation, the mechanics of it, and that is a very popular word in pop culture right now. If you study the law of attraction and manifestation, it is literally synonymous with the creative process. And if you look at, again, the dialectic we're talking about, our evolution or our march toward human potential, it's the ultimate creative process. So do you see how art reflects life? That's the entire title of today's program. Art reflects life. I hope you make those connections. So self-expression, I would say, is often because we do connect as a result. One of the definitions of art is wholeness, a recognition of our interconnectedness. Okay, I took that way off, and I added to it in terms of my understanding of it. But I love that you brought up the word self-expression.
This is more of a question from Sylvester Macy. Would you call overcoming self-doubt or believing in yourself a moment in a story catharsis?
Of course. I mean, we spoke about how the hero's journey is usually meek to empowered. We talked about rag to riches is usually a form of empowerment. Other words are purpose, right? Sort of stepping into your purpose. And in the hero's journey, there's a period of denial. You know, when Luke Skywalker finally sees his crispy aunt and uncle on the plane, that's when it's personal suddenly, and he can't deny his calling anymore. That's another good word. So believe it or not, overcoming self-doubt, which is the theme of most Miyazaki films that I've seen anyway, is the meek to empowered template, which is the ultimate hero's journey. Of course, that's a catharsis. Yeah. Did it happen to him? I would wonder.
Annie Chen said for her, catharsis is healing spiritually. And when forming a story, it helps me using my own experience, emotion to capturing the pure essence of the story. The process helps me relive my experience and save myself from the troubled time.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to?
Beautiful. Well, just beautiful. Thank you for that. Yes, I relate. I agree with, I mean, I would love to hear it again. I'm going to watch this later, but I think it all resonated with me. In my own experience, I do like to say, you know, The Nameless Prince and its sequel, The Royal Trinity, it's not high fantasy, it's urban fantasy, but it's fantasy, which is not everybody's genre. My sister could give it about fantasy. She's more into literary fiction. But I like writing in a genre because it provides regiments, you know, and rules, and you feel like you're part of a tradition or a group. So I just grew up on fantasy, you know, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and Roald Dahl and a lot of influences. But I love fantasy. But my point is, I think my sister, for example, no offense, Renee, but I think you had to explain to you at one point that it doesn't make it any less authentic. Every single word of both of my novels that I mentioned, and all of my work, frankly, but those two fantasy novels, every word is from experience. I would not fabricate or make something up at all because it wouldn't feel right. I would end up relying on a trope or a stereotype or a cliche, right? If I didn't draw directly on experience. So I've used the example, I think last week, of going through the Seek in Petra Jordan to Petra. And like, that informed the texture and the ambiance and the details that lent resonance and authenticity to a particular sequence. So if it's not a direct emotional patterning that I'm drawing on, which of course, again, if you look at The Nameless Prince, it's about a milestone that I think we all go through, maybe at different times, but I call the main theme of that overcoming the rage of futility. Or just, overcoming disillusionment. So in this character's case, it was a form of rage. He just was a kid that started acting out in school. And of course, he had a lot of problems at home, but it was all unexamined and unanalyzed. And so in his case, it was rage. He was acting out. But once he got to the bottom of the rage, it was sadness, and it always is. So sadness is another word for disillusionment. So the clinical theme was, how do we overcome disillusionment? How do we come out the other end and go on? It is a milestone. So of course, it was something that was important to me emotionally because it's been a theme in my life. That's why I wrote about it. So I'm agreeing with you there. And then the second book, just because I like to give more personal examples, it makes it click more. As we said, learning is emotional. So for me, the personal examples might help you grasp the material. The second book, The Royal Trinity, the characters are a little older. They've gone from elementary school to high school. They're 15 and 16. And although they're not quite old enough to feel what I was feeling when I wrote it, I was a little older when I wrote that second one. So the theme of the second one is overcoming futility. Very different than disillusionment. Disillusionment was that moment in which a character his age, 11, looks around and goes, wow, the world is not the place they told me. There's no Easter Bunny, there's no Santa Claus. We can all, right? It's not the place they told me. The futility theme was a little bit more about, okay, well, I've been doing my best with life, and there's still entropy, and there's still gravity, and there's still inertia. Things get in, despite my best efforts. We do need to tackle that at some point. We all need faith and hope renewed daily to get up one more day. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Maybe, maybe you don't, but I do think a lot of people, especially right now, need to renew their own faith, and they need the tools in which to do that. So I hope that makes sense. I wrote about them because I was passionate about them. I had lived them. I will quickly also say there's still room for growth. My personal catharsis, I hope this makes it all come together. No matter how well my intention is inspired and then set, no matter how well I organize the plot structure, I move those turning points around so that this is foreshadowed here and it'll have more resonance when it happens here. This plot point has to explain this emotional turning point here. I literally, I think I said last week, use 3x5 cards and I move them around on a corkboard. Of course, it gets digitized at some point. but I like how malleable it is that way. So no matter how well organized my story structure is, and I think I know where I'm headed, I know the outcome, I know the want and the need, I know what I'm trying to impart, I know the main theme. Of course, it takes on a life of its own. Sub-themes develop when I include that texture, and when I include those emotional details and those perceptual details that give the texture and the ambiance, takes on a life of its own. So I mentioned Madeline Lingle last week, how she said, well, the character just had to die because I didn't see it coming, but again, the sum became larger than the whole of its parts. No, the whole became larger than the sum of its parts. That happens to me all the time. Point being, I inevitably get to a point where I think, shit, I really don't know the ending. Like, I don't know how the specifics are gonna play out. I don't always want to put a bow on things. I love ambiguous endings that are melancholy or bittersweet or open to interpretation. But I inevitably realize I'm writing my own life as I'm wrapping up my novels. And it's a lot of responsibility. It's very scary when you realize, shit, I'm making decisions for my own life about my policy, not my worldview or my value system, but sort of my policy on an A, B, C, or D.
So much like life, right?
Art reflects life. That's
yeah.
true.
There is another definition here, John Pattison, about the definition of catharsis for him. Says, I feel catharsis is a healing and learning activity.
Of course, I love that definition. Healing has come up several times. I love that. Was it Marvin Gaye? Sexual healing? Is that Marvin Gaye? I mean, right? I think tactile is everything in life. You feel connected through tactility, and you don't have that in a novel, right? But you can go there. I happen to love film because it engages all the senses. Truly, think about it. I mean, I love film because you're so immersed in that virtual reality that's been created on screen because you're engaging all the senses. And how could you not learn more, right, spiritually, when your emotions are heightened to that degree? All that stimulus using all of your sense organs creates a higher chemical balance, which would be emotion. I think I'm just a big lover of film. Anyway, healing, I love that.
And you have another question. You asked people, what is story?
Mm-hmm.
And Annie Chen said, story is the way of humans passing down past life experiences.
Right. Well, remember last week, one of the first things we did is I repeated what I do in my classes every term, the first day, especially visual development. For 20 years, I basically said, not just what is story, but why are we so driven to tell stories? Why do we tell stories? So that is always one of the first responses. You know, we said to leave a mark, create permanence. We said a number of things, but to impart literally knowledge, like how to start a fire, but also to impart wisdom. Yeah, maybe I'll read some of the further quotes that I have so I feel like I've done my job. Okay, so let's just see where this goes. I'll just start reading. Now, I happen to love Tennessee Williams. I'm not big on imposing my tastes, but I'm going to. And some of these are my muses and my mentors, some of them dead. But surely you've heard of Streetcar Named Desire. I think that's the most familiar in pop culture. But Tennessee Williams is one of those tragic characters that I mentioned earlier that seems to have suffered from his art, but then been consumed by his demons, actually. And not to go too dark, but Suddenly Last Summer is a wonderful classic that you should watch. And it's Kate Hepburn and Montgomery Clift. Again, two people you should know, just my opinion. But it's pretty dark. I mean, I think the opening scene is this image of sea turtles. As you know, they lay their eggs on shore in the sand, but then the turtles have to make their way to the water before getting picked off by seagulls. And very few of them make it to the water. So it's such a great metaphor. But sadly, that did happen to him. His demons got the best of him. I mean, the whole movie, it's Liz Taylor too, by the way. The whole movie is very haunting because there's also these natives that are sort of always on the fringes of the screen trying to get at the main character. So I just find it amazing that did play out in Tennessee Williams' life, and he didn't make it to the finish line. Anyway, he says, When I stop working, the rest of the day is posthumous. I love that. I'm only really alive when I'm writing. Not recommending that. Success is blocked by concentrating on it and planning for it. Whatever. Success is shy. It won't come out while you're watching. I guess that's a little bit related to what we said. When you're too fixated on an outcome or a goal, it's sort of death to your manifestation of your desires. I have found it easier to identify with the characters who verge upon hysteria. If you know Tennessee Williams's work, every piece has what I call a woman on the verge of destitution. She's usually in her 50s. Then there's always the loner who goes to the movies and you don't know why. And then there's always the gentleman caller that provides hope for the destitute woman. Like, it's a template, almost like Shakespearean templates. Oh, we didn't go over those. But anyway, this clicks if you know Tennessee Williams. I have found it easier to identify with the characters on the verge of hysteria, who are frightened of life, who are desperate to reach out to another person. But these seemingly fragile people are the strong people, really. I love that because I think, again, this word empaths is thrown around a lot. Empaths. Well, I'm sorry, I'm a very intuitive person it took me a while to separate my shit from other people's shit, call it what you want, but I have a very thin skin, so whatever, I'm an empath, but I don't put myself in a separate category. I think we're all intuitive and we all can tap into that if we choose to. So, but this does kind of speak to this idea of being empathic, but also I would argue all artists are extremely empathic. He also said, if the writing is honest, it cannot be separated from the man who wrote it. So these worldviews, these value systems we're talking about, it's the very reason I objected when they told Meryl to compartmentalize and do her dog and pony show, if that makes sense. This also, speaks to the authenticity idea. Like one of the Q&A responses a moment ago spoke to using sensory details from one's life, but more importantly, emotional experiences from one's life. You literally, in my opinion, can't separate the artist from the work. It's one and the same. Tennessee Williams also said, if I got rid of my demons, I'd lose my angels. I love that. Catharsis is about cleansing and healing. There's that word, healing. I love it. And it's Desmond Tutu. You're in good company. Catharsis is about cleansing and healing at one and the same time. Healing memories and attitudes, healing the spirit and the heart. Guillermo del Toro is one of my favorite filmmakers. Last week, we talked a lot about Pan's Labyrinth, one of my favorite films. He says, and I don't think of his work as horror. It's got a lot of substance. It's not slasher for sure. I think he identifies as a horror in a broader sense, filmmaker. The horror story was birthed when we became sedentary cavemen and started telling scary stories to keep children from wandering off into the night. True. Today, there's nothing more cathartic for a guy in a three-piece suit, someone super wound up and super tight, to get on a roller coaster of a horror film and scream like a madman. I might have said schoolgirl a minute ago. That's what I love about fairy tales. They tell the truth, not organized politics, religion, or economics. Those things destroy the soul. That is the idea behind Pan's Labyrinth. I think that 50% of the narrative is in the audio-visual storytelling. That's kind of what I was saying about engaging all the senses. I happen to think the screenplay is the basis of it all. It definitely doesn't tell the movie. It tells the story, but doesn't tell the whole movie. So he's just kind of saying the emotions are heightened when you engage all the senses. And since most of us are probably animation people, this is worth talking about. The sound design as a filmmaker, I actually get suckered into the story and I don't analyze. I'm a sucker for story, but I couldn't help but notice sound design plays a huge, huge role in his films. Stanley Kubrick, we all know him. If you don't, God, where do you start? But 2001, A Space Odyssey, Clockwork Orange, more recently, Eyes Wide Shut, amazing filmmaker that has influenced many, many filmmakers. And by the way, animation is no different. It comes from the tradition of live action film and sort of evolved neck and neck with it. So I always say the film language that I teach in my biz dev class and my backgrounds class, the film language itself is identical. They're borrowing from one another constantly. So not to preach, but man, if you don't know your film history, you might want to, I used to say rent videos and play catch up, but I mean, Netflix, do your little search, do your searches and watch that stuff. Couldn't hurt. Anyway, Stanley Kubrick, the same can be said for screenwriters. Whatever, he's referring to something. The same can be said of screenwriters. You can study story and structure all you want, but until you actually sit down and write, you won't learn anything. The theoretical study of film and screenwriting have little to do with the actual process of crafting a story, much of which is instinctual, which is why I was recommending analyzing it and then letting it be second nature. And I think when we get back to our intuition, that's when we're able to draw on our own personal experiences. I think if you cobbled something together just to fulfill a template, it would have the wrong intention, right? So the inspiration would lack, number one, and then the happy accidents, the organic synchronicity would probably not happen, but also it would be derivative, as they call it, right? Because it would fall back on old, tired tropes, cliches, and stereotypes. I'm gonna go for, so there's a couple more Kubrick ones. It'll be in the supplemental reading. I love Sarah McLachlan, so I'm going to give her a shout out. Songwriter Sarah McLachlan. Having the opportunity to express myself through music has been extremely cathartic for me my entire life. Storytelling is the most powerful way to put ideas into the world today. Robert McGee. Love this one. There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. Let me say that again. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. That's Maya Angelou. Storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it. There's a lot there, but meditate on that one when you have time. Storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it. I do experience this. Like even this, it's hard for me to speak about definitive things. That's why we didn't go nuts and bolts. We went a little more philosophical and spiritual, because there's very little one can say that's definitive, right? I mean, use the Socratic method, you can disprove any definitive statement because circumstances and conditions are always evolving. Nothing is ultimately true other than mathematical axioms. Does that make sense? So, so committing the error of defining it. I hate writing academic books. I'm going to write this into a book because I feel like it is a calling, and there's my teaching has taught me so much. But I would much rather write fiction and not have to justify or qualify my worldviews and observations. I hope that makes sense. But that's what I get from that. That when you infuse poetry into something, and it can be in a film, it can be in prose, it can be in poetry itself, every format of every genre, every subgenre of every genre of every format in art and literature can take a poetic non-linear approach that speaks to the soul without engaging the intellect. And to me, that's kind of what we probably need to do to hit people on a core level, because again, we learn emotionally. So without the error of defining it. I love that. The human species thinks in metaphors and learns through stories. That's Mary Catherine Bateson. Stories are a communal currency of humanity. That's from the Arabian Nights, actually. And I don't know if Tahir Shah is a character. Okay, now this is specific to animation. And again, I'm guessing a lot of us are animation folks. So Maurice Sendak, I actually saw him speak at UCLA one time. He doesn't like children, strangely, but he thinks like one. So he's right there with them. So Maurice Sendak, if you don't know him, check him out. He says, from the earliest years, children live on familiar terms with disrupting emotions, fear, and anxiety are an intrinsic part of their everyday lives. They continue to cope with frustrations as best they can. And it is through fantasy that children achieve catharsis. It is the best means they have for taming wild things. And Wild Things is the title of probably his most well-known work. Ari Aster says you need to find the catharsis in whatever story you're telling. That's the equivalent of finding the love in the project you're working on or the assignment, whatever it is. Oh, can't argue with the Dalai Lama. Got to include this one. To reduce destructive emotions, we need to strengthen constructive emotions. That's what I meant actually by disentangling certain neural circuits and to create room for new ones, shifting paradigms, replacing old, tired mantras or narratives with new ones, to put myself in good company with the Dalai Lama. For example, to counter anger, we cultivate love and compassion. Mahatma Gandhi says, in a gentle way, you can shake the world. Socrates, the secret to, and I don't know if I buy this, I have to research this more, because you often see quotes misattributed to people, and it could be the interpretation from ancient Greek, but this seems a little contemporary. But apparently Socrates said, the secret to change is to focus all of your energy, not on fighting the old, but on building the new. So again, don't beat the old drum, look to the future. We all know the war on drugs, Nancy Reagan saying just say no, only compounded the problem. So there is, in manifestation and the law of attraction, there's this idea, if you just keep giving airtime to a problem, it's a different frequency than the solution. So I think societally, you just saw with the war on drugs idea, even copycat this or that, right? I hate to say it, but copycat school shootings, I mean, come on, I'm 53 years old. I never saw a high-speed chase in the media. The minute they started filming them with helicopters, suddenly everyone wanted their 15 minutes of fame. And that copycat phenomenon is alive and well for whatever reason. I, on a spiritual level, attribute it to the law of attraction. And when you give your airtime to something, it only, what you put your attention on grows. So anyway, there is a parallel here. You know, the stories we tell are the equivalent of tuning in our cultural radio station, right? Or giving airtime to whatever we choose to. Again, those action adventure films might be feeding cultural addictions to those neurotransmitter chemicals that don't benefit our proliferation. So it's all the same conversation here, in my opinion. I'm going to wrap this up, Tina, by saying, to end on an inspiring note, two more quotes. You may be a little, again, I think if you rewatch it, it's pretty linear, but in case you're a little confused, my premise is, and there's no right or wrong here, it's just me synthesizing different schools of thought and offering it up as a suggestion, because it feels like my calling to, I don't know, support artists and sort of get them to look at why they're doing what they do. So my premise being that if we're getting our personal catharsis through our art, and then the patron is experiencing their own catharsis as a result, then the macro is affected. If it's not clear exactly how that all happens, I'm going to rely on people with more credibility than me to get that point across. Mahatma Gandhi very wisely said, be the change you wish to see in the world. It does start, it's an inside job is the way I would put it. The lens through which you see the world has everything to do with your beliefs. A belief is just a thought you keep thinking. Michael Jackson said, I'm going to make a change in the world. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but the lyrics are literally, I'm starting with the man in the mirror. All right, and then my final quote, hopefully will tie everything together that we've talked about and maybe give a little call to action in the form of inspiration. And I just discovered this guy in my research, but man, he coined the basic premise of, you know, this presentation for sure. Teilhard, and I can't say it perfectly, but Teilhard de Chardin was a priest, scientist, paleontologist, theologian, philosopher, and teacher. Pretty good resume. And for me, I think sometimes the woohoo stuff that can't be quantified or proven using the scientific method in empirical circles is dismissed as quackery sometimes. When you have somebody that broad on the spectrum from, well, I keep calling it empiricism, right, to sort of what's called rationalism, you just kind of can't argue with that wisdom because he didn't blind himself to science. He's a paleontologist and a theologian. He's a scientist and a priest. Okay, so, you know, you put the word philosophy on something and suddenly it can discredit it in the eyes of some. Anyway, he popularized a term we used last week called the noosphere. It's that invisible realm of our ideas, morals, norms, mores, thought forms, principles, codes, ethics, all those invisibles that need to evolve along with our biology lest we become extinct because we're not adaptable. So this guy that coined, which I have used the term noosphere, but I didn't know he said this. And I just found it in my research. So the noosphere, to redefine it, is a postulated sphere or stage of evolutionary development dominated by consciousness, the mind, and interpersonal relationships. In the phenomenon of man, he posits that human spiritual development is moved by the same universal laws as material development. It's pretty much what we've been saying the whole time today. Now, he wrote, everything is the sum of the past, and nothing is comprehensive except through its history. So again, the word in French for history, histoire, is the same whether you're talking about an histoire d'enfant, which is a children's book, or l'histoire du monde, the history of the world. So hopefully that all clicks. And his last quote is, nature is the equivalent of becoming and self-creation. That is the title of Michelle Obama's autobiography, and she can do no wrong in my eyes. And then self-creation. In some other presentations, I talked about Elton John's biopic, and then a few others. The one that almost won the Oscar and then didn't. Anyway, I really respond to films that are about self-creation in defiance of the voices of dissent or doubt, or even in defiance of fate. Self-creation is where it's at. Final quote, we were all created by collective intelligence to transform to our fullest potential in order to contribute or benefit evolution. And then I add, the contribution of the individual helps usher us towards human capacity and potential. In other words, life is about not missing opportunities to grow or break cycles or repeat patterns. Storytelling is the best way in which to transform. Keep doing it.
There is a question. Should you, Babetta is asking, what is your biggest challenge when writing a story that's very personal to you?
Wow. Well, I really have stepped into, by the way, telling the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, telling the truth, right? We all say storytelling or art. Some people say art is artifice, right? Some people say, no, art reveals the truth despite the matrix, the illusion. You have your own views on it. But to me, being a writer, of course, is about telling the truth. And that's the good and the bad and the ugly. So I do it. And sometimes I have to say, well, no one will ever read this. And it's not a diary entry. It is a piece of literature, but posthumously, maybe they'll unearth it. I don't know. But I have to give myself that permission sometimes and not worry about hurting people. So to be honest, when it's, and I do write what's called creative nonfiction. I write essays that are not fiction. A new genre was created because Oprah nailed somebody on being a little bit inauthentic with his details. And so they sort of broadened the genre into creative nonfiction to give license, creative license. But when I write an essay that's 100% from life with no fabrication, you of course worry about how it's going to land with friends and family and loved ones. I come from a dysfunctional alcoholic family. I'm the one person, I mean, we've all read The Adult Children of Alcoholics, all of my siblings and I, but of course we don't talk about it all day, every day, because my parents are still alive. And frankly, I don't want their golden years to be marred by regret. So I've really stepped into this idea, like, it's not my job to evolve them. So, but there's still a tiny part of me, and my sister and I we're a writer's group, just the two of us, and thank God for her. But anyway, we often talk about, is anyone going to read this? Are they going to be hurt by it? My feeling is our souls are all on the same page. Truly, core consciousness, it's all collective. So I don't love when an actor like from Paper Moon, what's her name? I can't think of her name. Anyway, I mean, let's just talk about Mommy Dearest, for example. To wait until, now I can't think of her name, I'm so tired, Betty Davis and Joan Crawford. To wait until Joan Crawford died to write a story that basically bashed her legacy, that seems unkind to me. So I don't know, just because somebody's physical body is gone, if destroying their legacy is my job. This whole cancel culture of erasing people's legacies is really distasteful to me. So anyway, I do, to let myself off the hook and give myself permission, I often think, well, their body's still here. Why does it make it different if, because I think intelligence goes on. I mean, collective intelligence and life goes on. So, but if my parents like went in the ground and then I wrote something publicly that revealed something that might hurt them, I do feel like, well, their souls understand, we're all connected on a soul level. That's how I let myself off the hook. That is my biggest block in my writing, is telling the truth and wondering who it's going to hurt. I don't have other creative blocks. I have a pretty good, if this helps, understanding the creative process, learning all the models, the Wallace model, all the other ones will help you get past whatever your writer's block is, whatever blank canvas syndrome you encounter. Understanding the value of all the steps in the creative process helps people get past things like, and I've mentioned this before, if the inspiration part is energizing to you, but then rendering it, executing it is not, usually it's because you fear something's been lost, that the inspiration won't transcend. When you understand the intellectual part of the creative process, that you're vacillating between hot and cold constantly, you get through that part because you understand its value. If you learn the creative process, you'll understand that if inspiration was there at the outset, it will transcend and speak to people by nature. So you get through the rendering. Personally, I find rendering or execution very meditative, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. I hope some of that helps, though I don't have any blocks other than the truth-telling thing.
Somebody said by talking about it, we form the new way of storytelling, find solution and give it meaning and purpose for you to rise from the situation. Another comment here from Sylvester says, the more I started learning about story, it blew my mind how hero's journey is so similar to our life.
Well, that's why I've said, I think every hero's journey, every story is a hero's journey. If you chose to frame it that way, every story is, because art reflects life, the title of today. Yeah, totally agree.
Another kind of question is, since everybody is seeing and experiencing films through their own filter, like you were saying earlier, what is your thought on how best to get a story to relate to the masses without homogenizing or formulaic processes? Do you have any tips or thoughts on that?
I think that's we could do a whole week on that, but
right.
Well, here, because I think know your audience, you've heard that a million times, right? Know your readership, know your audience. But I actually think, for me, being a writer is largely knowing how to appeal to people cerebrally or how to appeal to them viscerally and when. It's knowing what is culturally relative, what's going to land universally, and what's going to be culturally specific. It's the same thing as knowing what is innate to human experience, what is integral to the human condition. Sorry, I use Tori Amos as an example. A bit dated, but she's an amazing artist. But her lyrics are so obscure and poetic and personal that you don't know what the hell she's talking about half the time, but man, does it resonate because it is authentic. So I love when a great poetic writer, even in prose, loses me a little bit. It's still an experience and it's still infused with truth and resonance. So I just think that's what it is to be a writer. And if you're a visual storyteller, it's the same thing. Know what shape languages are culturally specific. Know what colors mean in a given culture. It's all the same conversation. There are always parallels between disciplines. But I do think that's part of what it is to be an artist, is to know if it's going to land in the brain, the viscera, or the heart. I guess, the mind, the heart, or the gut. Get to know what's universal and what's so personal that nobody is going to relate. And like I said, in those few examples, there might still be value in some fashion, even if it's 100% personal and nobody's going to get it, but they will project. It's human nature to project. I wanted to quickly give one example. When I say what it is to be a writer, for me, is knowing how you're appealing to people, their emotions, their visceral emotions, their intellect, or their cognitive powers. That applies to my filmmaking as well. So I think this will tie a lot of things together too. In that film, in that clip that you saw in the montage in the very beginning, that tear, the character was 100% meant to have her catharsis. So really quickly, somebody leaves a tip on her, she's a waitress, leaves a tip in the form of a diamond. She holds it up because I want, and I did a close-up on it because I want the audience to really consider what it means in all of this. For me, it meant, okay, this guy he actually dies and been perished, but he's left this thing behind. It's the beauty, the truth, the redemption, the beauty, you fill in the blank, but that which makes life rich and worth living. It didn't matter to me what people projected on it. As long as my general intention came across, I accounted for the projections of the patron. At the wrap party, man, I got some really sweet reviews in the book at the premiere, and everything I intended was written: beauty, truth, redemption, hope, blah, blah, blah. It was all right there according to people's life experiences. So that is the beauty of art. Really quickly, speaking to the brain, the mind, or the viscera, the brain, the heart, or the viscera, in that same film, I knew I wanted to appeal. My favorite films are the ones in which you have a gut reaction, you don't even know why. You can analyze the themes intellectually, and oh my God, nothing in my life relates to that. But I call it appeals to our core humanity. I can bawl and not know why, and they end up being my favorite films. And I realize in the end, I had a reaction because I'm human. That is my favorite kind of film. So I guess I strive for that in some of my films. And I very much wanted people to have a gut reaction and not know why in that one film where she sheds the tear. Then a few minutes later, I wanted it to click cerebrally. So they would not come up with a catchphrase or a philosophy, but actually come up with a policy to move forward without communicating that to my composer. And I'm not an iron-fisted director. I let people work their magic. I hope the writing is good enough that it speaks to people and informs their work, but I have almost no notes for my actors. I'm learning to get more involved. But anyway, working with a composer is one of my favorite parts of it. I have a guy named Robert Gulia in Hungary that's genius, and he's scored several of my films. Without telling him my approach of hitting him on the gut level, then cerebrally a little bit later with a philosophy, he matched every beat. There would be a deep cello that vibrates literally in your gut, right where I wanted it to. And then a couple seconds later, the cello would break, and there would be these ethereal springs that vibrate up here in this chakra. Amazing. So that's the power of the creative process when you let it flow.